can the religious prove that God exists? If we got a bunch of them together, could they actually present the evidence that we're looking for? Yeah, I wouldn't be holding my breath. But let's do exactly that. A bunch of theists from different religions trying to explain how God exists. And no, you're not going to be impressed by this because I know I wasn't. Because this is just sad. We're going to go look at an article in the Reno Gazette Journal that gathered a whole bunch of religious believers together to answer the question, can you prove that God exists? And the answer, of course, is no, but the mental gymnastics that these people go through to explain that, no, it can't be done, but they feel really, really good about believing it anyhow, it's just absurd. I think it's important to look at how these people think, because it's clear that they aren't really thinking, they're just reacting. They just want to believe these emotionally comforting tales. They can't justify any of it rationally, why they should actually think any of it is true. This is just an exercise in emotional stupidity. So, let's get started. So, he starts off with a discussion from Encyclopedia Britannica, and I don't figure I have to read that to you because it really doesn't matter. Individual theists define their gods however they define them, and that's what I go after when they get finished making up indemonstrable characteristics and stapling them to their imaginations. There's nothing real here to point to. This is just, well, this is what I believe, and this is what I want to be true. And that's not impressive. The important part comes next, though, and this is where I have to get to reading. It is often concluded, if one does not believe in God, no proof is sufficient enough. If one believes in God, no proof is required. And that's kind of a problem. I mean, the first part is a complete straw man. There certainly would be sufficient evidence for a God if one actually existed and we could demonstrate it in any objective way. But the last bit, where if you believe for emotional reasons, evidence is completely unnecessary, that's just stupid. People ought to need evidence for any position that they are going to hold, and the fact that the religious not only don't, but actively reject the idea, that's absurd on its face. Every single position that I consciously hold, I have sought out evidence to verify it first. All of them. Every single one. God doesn't get a pass, and that's why I don't believe in any gods, because I've actually gone and looked for evidence, and none actually exists. So, what the hell is wrong with the religious? That's what I want to know. Many find God's hand everywhere in creating the highly complex structures that could not have existed without a divine creator who can do anything he or she wants. There might be some force behind the existence of everything that exists, they add. Except just because you interpret God's involvement in everything, that doesn't mean that any gods actually exist. This is starting with a conclusion, and they're just backtracking to insert that conclusion into every possible scenario. Just because you really, really like the idea, that doesn't make the idea true. You need to provide direct and objectively demonstrable corroboration, and the religious can't actually do that, can they? Because this is never about reality. This is about emotion. This is about people wanting their fifis coddled and not caring if any of that translates into the objectively real world that we all share. And that's kind of sad, isn't it? Some find connection between science and religion, but many others see no valid scientific explanation for God. Many stress that God cannot be bound by the laws of science. Science is not in a position to prove or invalidate the existence of God, some feel. None of this is actually demonstrable, of course. It's all an excuse for why gods are all in the head and not in objective reality. And this is why we ask, Well, how do you know that? And how have you objectively tested your conclusion to see if it can withstand skeptical evaluation? Because for most of these people, they can't. They just want it to be true. Well, wanting doesn't make it so. Because I can just make something up out of whole cloth and pretend it's every bit as valid as their claims about gods, mostly because it is. Invisible, intangible, universe-creating pixies are, by definition, invisible and intangible. They can't be detected in any way. But they're still real, though, because, I said so. But my say-so isn't good enough, and neither is the say-so of the religious. You have to do a whole lot better than that, but you've just arbitrarily defined away any method by which you can show that your faith is based in anything remotely resembling reality. And that's kind of a dumb thing to do, isn't it? Some ask, does God have to exist? Well, no, God is an emotional security blanket worn by people with no emotional stake in reality, nothing more. At least the religious can't prove that it's anything more than that, and it rests entirely on their shoulders to do so if they want to be taken seriously. After that, he goes into some Hindu passages that, they don't impress me at all, so I'm going to skip that. You're going to have to prove to me that the Upanishads were factually reliable, just like you'd have to do that with every single religious book out there, and, good luck on that. Just because it says something in a book that you really, really like, that doesn't make it so. You have to do a whole lot better than that. And it's really too bad these people can't. So now we get to the beliefs of a Hindu monk. And no, I don't really give a crap what he believes either. This isn't about personal belief. It's about objective truth, and none of these people have any of that or any way to demonstrate that their beliefs actually make sense. Instead, he argues that God's existence can be proved to ourselves from our own experiences to our own satisfaction, but such proof will not necessarily be sufficient to convince others. Well, how is that any different than a child saying they are convinced that their imaginary friend exists, but, they can't prove it to anybody else? That's ultimately all that's going on here. It's all a bunch of emotionally frail people who really feel better thinking that an all-powerful deity out there somewhere is watching over them, and they are making excuse after excuse after excuse in an attempt to baldly rationalize it to themselves. But when it comes right down to it, they've got nothing at all to be proud of. This is all fee-fees over facts, emotions over evidence. They just don't care. But that's really kind of pathetic, isn't it? For a rational adult to accept something as true or potentially true, they're going to need a whole lot more than, but it makes me feel good. Because that's the way that children operate. And these people are ultimately just immature children living in adult bodies. I'm still trying to figure out how this is a good thing. Then he goes into Hinduism, laying out 4 paths by which they can supposedly come to know God. But trust me, they are absolutely nothing of the sort. Like I said, there's no demonstrable way to get there, and that's the important part of all of this. It has to be demonstrable. It has to be objective. You have to be able to prove demonstrably that you're anywhere remotely close to a god, and that doesn't work out well for them, does it? Because I could simply state that I have a 4-fold path that will prove that the aforementioned invisible pixies are real. Does that actually get me anywhere? No, not remotely. These are people looking for answers and inventing solutions to questions that don't actually exist. I'm not sure how that's really supposed to impress anyone, because it seems pretty damn pathetic to me. Next, we get down to some Unitarian Universalist, and sorry, but, the only Kevin Murphy I care about is this one. Anyway, he says, even the sophisticated 5 proofs of St. Thomas Aquinas, when carefully analyzed, prove to be tautologies. Well, that is true, and I've taken on Aquinas' 5 ways in the past, and they don't get you anywhere remotely close to objective truth. It's all wishful thinking for the sake of wishful thinking and nothing more. That's really all apologetics winds up being. It's excuses for the already faithful to continue to embrace their faith, even though there's no good, solid, logical, rational, and objective reason to think that any of it is actually true. Murphy continues, most believe, then fall back on faith or indications of divine existence, not proofs. Yeah, they do, but that's not a good thing. It's like they're really, really close to understanding what they're doing wrong. They just can never take that one extra step to reach actual reality. Jumping down a little, he continues to be close to the facts, if only he could take that one extra tiny little step. Apophatic theology asserts that God is so transcendent as to be unknowable. Then how can you possibly rationally believe it? To claim to know what is ultimately unknowable is wholly irrational on its face. Yet that's exactly what the religious do. They will tell us all about the characteristics of this inherently unknowable and unverifiable thing. Well, how exactly do they do that? Well, they don't. That's the problem. It's all just made up. So now we're off to the Jews, and they're no better. To prove color exists to someone blind, one relies upon those who can see it. Similarly, to prove God exists, and I'm not doing the GD thing, God, witnesses could provide proof. When the Exodus occurred, several million Israelites witnessed God's miracles and deliverance. Except that's absolutely not true. None of it is. I don't need somebody who can see color. I just need a mechanism that can consistently and reliably detect the difference between various wavelengths of light. But let's take this a step farther and ask how it is that there could be eyewitnesses to God if God can't be seen. Because I'm unaware of anyone who has a reliable God detector. Do you? And this is where we go right back to mythology, because there was no exodus from Egypt, at least not in reality. That's a story told in a fantasy book by people who really wish it was true. Because this is just something that some people really get off on because it makes them happy. It doesn't actually comport with the real world. It doesn't have any evidence to support it. And that's the problem. We're looking for evidence, and they're not. Because they're not interested in the objective facts at all, only in the things that stroke their overactive egos. She goes on to say that to prove gravity exists, the effects are seen. Similarly, God's effect on and in the world can be seen. Yeah, but gravity is objectively testable. If you drop a ball 100 times in the same location, it will always have the same effects. How do you do that for God in any objectively verifiable way? How do you demonstrate that God is actually responsible? Where can we get that direct, demonstrable correlation between cause and effect? Well, we can't, because it doesn't exist. It's just asserted baldly because that's what they want to believe. And I'm sorry, but that's just idiotic. There is a paradox when trying to prove God's existence, because God is not a material reality to be proved or not, but spirit, a metaphysical reality, and therefore we must learn to feel and live God's existence. Yeah, says you. How do you know any of that, and how have you tested it to see if it holds up to any kind of rational scrutiny? This is the problem that we have across all religious lines. It's just empty claims and blind faith, nothing that can be demonstrated to be factually correct. They just want to believe, and they think that's got to be enough, and they're wrong. They just are. Yet, you can do the same thing with absolutely any question you might have. Just make up an answer and say, well, it's spiritual. Yeah, but what is spiritual? What is the supernatural? How did you come to that conclusion, and how do you prove it? How is any of this different than just making something up out of whole cloth? For all we can tell, that's all any of these gods are, after all. Made up security blankets for people who are just terrified to live in the real world. They can't get anywhere close to answering any of these questions that I'm posing. And trust me, I've tried. They can't do any of it. They just make excuses and then run away. He goes on to say, as the Lord himself once said, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." Yet, they don't, do they? Not demonstrably, anyhow. Just because you can delude yourself into thinking that you have, that doesn't mean that you have. It just means that you've got some serious emotional problems that you have to deal with. And that pretty much describes religion, doesn't it? Baha'is believe God exists, but proving it is another matter. God is fundamentally outside the purview of science. There is no materially testable scientific hypothesis about the existence of God, any more than there is proof that infinity exists. Belief is always a leap of faith. But all of that is just an excuse. All of this is just an excuse. Most religions start off with a God that is reasonably testable, that walks with man, and that, at least their myths say, you can see their God if you're good enough. Then, when people start to ask questions, gods drift off into the territory of the imaginary. They can't allow their claims to be questioned, so they just remove their gods from the equation. Yet there is no difference at all between undetectable and imaginary. If you don't have any evidence for a thing, then you shouldn't believe that thing is real. It is idiotic to do otherwise. So, though we cannot know the essence of God, we know him by his signs. No, you can rationalize that things that you see were really caused by this God of yours. How can you prove it? We can all play the exact same game. The sun rises in the morning because of the will of invisible, intangible, universe-creating pixies. Of course, I can't prove it, you just have to have faith. Yeah, you can just see them by their signs, right? And I can just make up these signs and go, there they are. The fact that these people are so self-deluded into their beliefs, it's utterly absurd. Yet millions and millions and millions of people do it every single day. How stupid is this? It is difficult to prove God's existence in a scientific sense. No, it's utterly impossible because the religious have made it so on purpose. They've taken their delusions and consistently moved them beyond the ability of rational people to intelligently evaluate them. They are full of excuses. The one thing that they never have is a good reason to take any of their delusions seriously. They just want to believe it. Well, that doesn't mean that there's a good reason to do so. But they don't care because they're just not interested in having a rational relationship with reality. The real world is just too scary. They'd rather retreat into a childish fantasy. First is the argument of first cause. Everything has a cause. The wind has a cause. Our thoughts have a cause. This raises the question of what or who is the first cause of all that exists. One reasonable explanation is that God is creator and first cause. Now, we've taken on all of these things before and exposed them as the utterly idiotic ideas that they are, and I really don't want to do that again. It gets kind of tiring to do the same thing over and over and over again because they just don't listen, because they just don't care. The first cause is just special pleading, inventing an exception to the rule that everything needs a cause so that their God can be the cause that they desperately want. He then goes into the argument from design, which we've also dismantled many times before, and then he does the moral argument, proving that he really has no clue what the hell morality is, because none of these people ever seem to. These are terrible arguments, yet they are the bread and butter of the religious mindset. This is bald rationalization. It's trying to get to the conclusion that their fragile ego requires without having any good reason at all to think any of it is true to begin with. If this kind of stuff impresses you, then you've got problems. You really do. Finally, we reach a point of sanity where this professor tells the truth. Most people who believe that God exists do so, not because of some argument or another, but rather because of what they were taught to believe as children. It's a matter of childhood indoctrination. It's a matter of child abuse, filling the minds of innocent children with religious drivel before they have the capacity to ask rational questions and make decisions for themselves. For any argument to prevail, it must be sound, which means that it is logically valid and has all true premises. The major question is not regarding these arguments' validity, but rather the truth or falsity of their premises. Yet, if we evaluate the religious arguments, none of them stand up to any kind of critical evaluation at all. It's all about their pathetic fifis and wishful thinking masquerading as logical syllogisms. And whether these people like it or not, this is not a good thing. Thereafter, it goes through a couple of other theists with the same kind of predictable emotional pleas, so I'm going to save you from that. You've got the Catholic who asks if you want to experience God, and then he just quotes Bible verses. You've got the Buddhist who makes some pretty decent points about proving that non-existent things don't exist, and describing how people like the idea of gods, but that doesn't mean that gods are real. Then you've got a Mormon who thinks it's great that God can't be proven through objective means, because then who would need faith? Well, that's kind of the point. We shouldn't need faith. Faith is not a reliable path to truth. There's no need for faith when you have facts. Faith is just the excuse that you give yourself when you believe things for really, really bad reasons. The one thing that none of the theists in this article have provided is any good reason to take the crap in their head seriously. In fact, they all just make excuses for why they have no good reasons, why expecting good reasons or good evidence is such a bad thing to look for. Except it's not. They're the ones with the double standards, not us. We expect the same level of evidence for gods as we do for absolutely everything else, and they can't explain why that's not a good thing to expect. Because this isn't about reality for them, it's about an emotionally comforting fantasy. They just want it to be true. They just want their feelings to be coddled, and that's all just utterly childish. These people have problems, and it's about damn time we stopped playing along. Call them out on it. Ask them the hard questions and hold their feet to the fire. Don't let them get out of it by proclaiming faith. Faith in what? Well, how do you know your faith is true? How do you prove it? And if they can't, then the only response is to point and laugh. Tell them that their faith is completely empty, because faith doesn't mean anything. Because these people are just making fools of themselves, and I think it's about time we told them the truth. There is no justification in believing dumb things. It's time we called a spade, and we're just honest for the sake of honesty. They have no good reason to believe at all. Only children do as they do. They are children in every demonstrable way when they believe in imaginary father figures in the sky. And it's time for them to grow the hell up. It's time that we hold them to higher standards, because I'm done letting them harm society with their idiotic beliefs. Put up or shut up, theists. That's what it comes down to, because I'm done letting your stupidity go by unchallenged. Who's with me? Because I think this is something we all need to do.